Hello, BookTube. Well, we're back to OcTolkien. Another ongoing reading thing I'm doing here on this channel. I'm doing it in conjunction with Justin, a ghost reader, and James Chatham, where we talk all month long in October about the works of the master, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. And the work that I have taken on for the month is Tolkien's great, weird, mythopoetic epic, the Silmarillion. Which is I guess in a way you could call it the long backstory behind all of the tales and memories and songs and poems in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. All of this epic past that is so obviously present in The Lord of the Rings, but only in illusion, only in bits and pieces, and sometimes in direct memory. There's that great moment in the Council of Elrond where Frodo is astonished to realize that Elrond was alive during these incredibly early ages of mankind on Middle-earth, that he was alive, that he remembers. The full import of the fact that one of the races of Middle-earth, elves, are immortal. They don't age, they stay the same. So if you don't kill them, they will be around forever and ever. Elrond and Galadriel remember the whole history of Middle-earth. And there are other beings too. In the Lord of the Rings, the past is very much present, but it's not articulated. It's articulated in this book, and we are reading along. I want to stress again in my own readings that Lukash over at his channel did a series reading the Silmarillion, and it's wonderful. So I will leave the links to it down below because it's enormously worth watching, and my thoughts are sort of an addendum to that series. But last time we read the Ainulindale and the Vala Quenta, and those were short epic books detailing basically the gods of Tolkien's of his legendarium, the single creator god, and all of his lesser lieutenant gods, the Valar, that are still able to make suns and moons. They're still able to reshape planets and rise up mountain ranges and whatnot. They have basically limitless power, but they have a rotten apple in the bunch. One of their number is a Valar named Melkor, who is evil. He is born of envy. He is motivated by greed and lust and hatred of his fellow Valar, especially when they thwart him, and they do a few times. Every time he breaks out and becomes extremely unruly, they constrain him. They gather together and constrain him, and then unaccountably release him again. What was that? What was that? That was a dramatic entrance, wasn't it? Oh, you made the entrance. You might as well see your fans. There you go. Oh. Oh. Ooh. Ooh. She burst open the door. That was very dramatic, even for Frida. And I remember mentioning last time that although the two books that we read last time are beautifully written, there's not much in the way of drama. It's tough to feel drama when one immortal, indestructible god is fighting against a bunch of other immortal, indestructible gods. Really, the drama only enters the story when the children of Middle-earth start to wake up. First the elves, and then men. And boy, oh boy, once that starts to happen, the Silmarillion starts to shake off a lot of the Old Testament forbidding quality that it has for first-time readers. Once that starts to happen, you start to get big personalities. The Silmarillion, the part that we're reading today is the first, what have we got here? The first 12 books of the Quenta Silmarillion. And right away, even in those first 12 books, we get some large personalities. There are a handful, 3 or 4, large personalities that Tolkien scatters throughout these stories that are incredibly compelling. These are the elder days of Middle-earth. These are when things were very different. And the first of those major conflicted, tragic, evil characters that we get, not completely evil, but charismatic, doomed, in the Old Norse sense of the word. The first of those that we get is a character named Fëanor, who let me read you this. The story of his birth is incredibly touching. Do you want to go out now, Bean? Is that it? No. The story of his birth, of Feanor's birth, is incredibly touching. It's also incredibly an incredible echo of the sagas of Norse mythology, the sagas of the Icelandic realm. Tolkien pours his heart and soul into these stories, I think, in many ways that he couldn't do in Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings captures others of his strengths, but the epic Book of Common Prayer, Old Testament, King James rhythm, this gigantic rocking rhythm, is scarcely anywhere in the Lord of the Rings, and it's I believe it grows a little in the telling of the Lord of the Rings, but it's all over the Silmarillion. So it's a major writer writing in a very different register, which is interesting enough as it is. But here's the story of Feanor's birth, which has a very touching little moment in it. In that time was born in Eldamar, in the house of the king of Tirion, upon the crown of Tuna, the eldest of the sons of Finwë, and the most beloved. Curu Finwë was his name, but by his mother he was called Feanor, spirit of fire, and thus he is remembered in all the tales of the Noldor. Miriel was the name of his mother, who was called Serinde because of her surpassing skill in weaving and needlework. For her hands were more skilled to fineness than any hands even among the Noldor. The love of Finwë and Miriel was great and glad, for it began in the blessed realm in the days of bliss. But in the bearing of a son, Miriel was consumed in spirit and body, and after his birth she yearned for release from the labor of living. And when she had named him, she said to Finwë, "Never again shall I bear child, for strength that would have nourished the life of many has gone forth into Feanor." Then Finwë was grieved, for the Noldor were in their youth in their days, and he desired to bring forth many children into the bliss of Aman. And he said, "Surely there is healing in Aman? Here all weariness can find rest." But when Miriel languished still, Finwë sought the counsel of Manwë, and Manwë delivered her to the care of Irmo in Lorien. At their parting, for a little while, he thought, Finwë was sad, for it seemed an unhappy chance that the mother should depart and miss the beginning, at least, of the childhood days of her son. "It is indeed unhappy," said Miriel, "and I would weep if I were not so weary. But hold me blameless in this, and in all that may come after." She went into the gardens of Lorien and lay down to sleep. But though she seemed to sleep, her spirit indeed departed from her body, and passed in silence into the halls of Mandos. The maidens of Este tended to the body of Miriel, and it remained unwithered, but she did not return. Then Finwë lived in sorrow, and he went often to the garden of Lorien, and sitting beneath the silver willows beside the body of his wife, called her by her names. But it was unavailing, and alone in all the blessed realms he was deprived of joy. After a while he went to Lorien no more. And I think in the course of the Silmarillion, that is the first time that we realize the dramatic effect that Tolkien can have on us with these mythical characters. That is just a beautiful moment. The husband sitting by the body of his wife, calling her names over and over again, and it not coming to anything. It's not going to come to anything. She's gone. "Frida, where are you? I am talking about Tolkien, and you are wandering all around making trouble. Just settle down." That is a wonderful moment, that's what I was saying. And it's also part of the larger story of Feanor, because he is a spirit of fire. He is a very conflicted character. He burns with all sorts of urgencies and energies that he himself can barely contain and that give him no rest. So this is a tragic birth. It's a birth to a tragic character. Feanor and his sons will become crucial to the whole story of the Silmarillion and the forging of the Silmarils, these three utterly gorgeous gems that are, as Tolkien makes clear about the ring later on in The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarils are quasi-sentient. They feel and think. They have an existence not articulated, but still, they're not just gems. They're mystical gems. And that the grip of fascination that they have on Feanor and on his sons is mirrored eventually by a grip of fascination that they have on Melkor himself. This Vala who ought to have no fascination with anything created by a mortal being. This this Vala, who is an energy being himself and has been present at the seat of the enormous beauty of the birth of creation. But the besetting sin of Melkor is envy, is covetousness, and so he does lust for the Silmarils. And there's a scene where a little later on, where Feanor has been banished. He and his father's gone with him. He's gone into banishment because of his violent temper. The Valar have banished him, and Melkor goes to him in his banishment. It is told that for a time Melkor was not seen again in Valinor, nor was any rumor heard of him, until suddenly he came to Formenos and spoke with Feanor before his doors. Friendship he feigned with cunning argument, urging him to his former thought of flight from the trammels of the Valar. And he said, "Behold, the truth of all that I have spoken, and how thou art banished unjustly. But if the heart of Feanor is yet free and bold as were his words in Tirion, then I will aid him, and bring him far from this narrow land. For am I not also a Valar? Yea, and more than those who sit in pride in Valimar. And I have been ever a friend to the Noldor, more skilled and most valiant of the people of Arda." And we're told, now Feanor's heart was still bitter at his humiliation before Mandos, and he looked at Melkor in silence, pondering if indeed he might yet trust him so far as to aid him in his flight. And Melkor, seeing that Feanor wavered, and knowing that the Silmarils had held his heart in thrall, said at the last, "Here is a strong place, and well guarded, but think not that the Silmarils will lie safe in any treasury within the realm of the Valar." But his cunning overreached his aim. His words touched too deep, and awoke a fire more fierce than he designed, and Feanor looked upon Melkor with eyes that burned through his fair semblance and pierced the cloaks of his mind, perceiving there his fierce lust for the Silmarils. Then hate overcame Feanor's fear, and he cursed Melkor and bade him begone, saying, "Get thee from my gate, thou jail-crow of Mandos." And he shut the doors of his house in the face of the mightiest of all the dwellers of Ea. Then Melkor departed in shame, for he was himself in peril. And he saw not his time yet for revenge, but his heart was black with anger. And that anger will be meted out on Feanor and his sons. This is the wrong being to shut the door in the face of. But that's a wonderful moment, because you have to keep in mind, remember what we talked about last time. We talked about the fact that in Tolkien's Legendarium, things start out pure and strong and mighty and then decrease in all of those things as time goes on. Time wears things out, but it hardly ever brings anything to full strength. And we're told, I mean, you have to keep in mind, that confrontation is between not Sauron and an Elf Lord. A confrontation, a direct face-to-face confrontation between Sauron and an Elf Lord would be drastically, in the terms of the Lord of the Rings, would be drastically uneven. It would be over in an instant. But rather, that's a confrontation between an Elf Lord and someone who eclipses Sauron in power, a god. And that is an indication in these early stories. It's a thing to keep in mind about Feanor and his sons and all the rest of the Noldor and the Eldar. It's a thing to keep in mind is that these early elves in their early days are far more. They're far mightier and grander beings than the elves that we encounter in the Lord of the Rings, even the oldest of the elves that we encounter in the Lord of the Rings, where to the point where such confrontations can be possible, where these elves, and a little later on in the Silmarillion, another elf actually contends physically in combat with Melkor. That, I think, increases the dramatic stakes quite a bit. In the Lord of the Rings, there is no real direct confrontation with Sauron. That is not really possible. And that means that everything happens through cat's paws or in a doomed context. Whereas in the Silmarillion, elves, and to a lesser extent men, contest directly with gods, not just with their servants. And that is reflected later on in another part where later on, right at the end of the bit that we're reading today, in the chapter called Of Men, Tolkien is explicit about what men and elves are like in a way that I want to read to you here. Immortal were the elves, and their wisdom waxed from age to age, and no sickness nor pestilence brought death to them. Their bodies indeed were the stuff of earth, and could be destroyed. And in those days they were more like the bodies of men since they had not long been inhabited by the fire of their spirit, which consumes them from within in the courses of time. But men were more frail, more easily slain by weapon or mischance, and less easily healed, subject to sickness and many ills, and they grew old and died. What may befall their spirits after death the elves do not know. Some say that they too go to the halls of Mandos, where we saw the spirit of Fëanor's mother go. Some say that they too go to the halls of Mandos, but their place of waiting there is not that of the elves. And Mandos under Iluvatar, the sole deity that we met last time, alone, save Manwë, knows whither they go there after a time of recollection in those halls beside the outer sea. None have ever come back from the mansions of the dead, save only Beren, son of Barahir, whose hand had touched a Silmaril. But he never spoke afterwards to mortal men. The fate of men after death, maybe, is not in the hands of the Valar, nor was all foretold in the music of the Ainur. So it's a mystery. And a deep mystery, too. If we don't, it's one thing if the elves don't know, but if it's maybe not even in the original music that was the blueprint of this entire universe, that's something else again. We don't know. Tolkien doesn't just say that they are chaff, that they're put into the fire and consumed. He doesn't come out and say that men are not immortal in any way. Elves are immortal, yes, physically. And also spiritually. Their bodies will live forever unless they're killed, but even when their bodies are killed, their spirits go to the halls of Mandos and wait. And in a couple of cases in the Tolkien Legendarium, it seems like they are reborn as themselves. They come back in a new body. But one way or another, they're not gone. Ever. The elves are permanent beings. And it's interesting to me that Tolkien isn't willing to say that's a sole attribute of them. We're not 100% sure that men aren't eternal as well, but I like the way he lays out the differences there, because when he's telling us that men are vulnerable to illnesses and sickness, he's also hinting at something he's hinted at many times in these first 12 books of the Quenta Silmarillion, which is that men are also vulnerable in lots of other ways too. They're more temptable, they're more corruptible, they're weaker in every way. You have to read between the lines a lot of the time to see what they have in their favor, what they have going for them. Aside from the fact that, as we're told over and over again in Lord of the Rings, they are the ultimate inheritors. They are the inevitable inheritors of Middle-earth. The age of men is coming. We don't know why that is, except that elves are just leaving. They're sick of Middle-earth. But if they weren't and they stuck around, you have to read between the lines a lot in the Silmarillion to see the upside of humans, of normal humans. I think you can find it, and we'll look for it. But it's nowhere in evidence in these first 12 books, and that is where we're going to stop for today, all the way up to the chapter of men, which means that next time for OcTolkien, next week in OcTolkien, we will finish out the Quenta Silmarillion, which goes from let's see here, the chapter "The Return of the Noldor," all the way to the Voyage of Erendil and the War of Wrath. So this will encounter. This will encompass Beren and Luthien. It will encounter Tuor and Gondolin. This will encompass all of that. Some very high fantasy, epic writing in these next 12 books, and we'll do that for next Sunday before we move on. So again, as always with OcTolkien, I want to know what you're making of this. Those of you who are in fact reading the Silmarillion along with me, it wasn't a requirement, but if you are, what are you making of all of this? Are you in fact liking it? I confess it took me a bit of time to like the Silmarillion as much as I do. I now love it. I think the parts of it that are beautiful beyond anything that Tolkien's template allows him to do in Lord of the Rings. I think the parts of the Lord of the Rings that are beautiful in the same utterly epic way as the parts in the Silmarillion are very few. Whereas in the Silmarillion, they occur all the time. And my contention is that in these next 12 books of the Quenta Silmarillion, the final 12 books of the Quenta Silmarillion, is where the beauty is at its peak. Just amazing in terms of action, in terms of epic sweep, in terms of character insight. You see if you agree with me when you read them. But these next 12 books are the heart and soul of the Silmarillion. The fates of the Silmarillion, this strange, unbreakable compulsion that the Silmarils exert on everyone, really comes to a head in the next 12 books. So let me know what you thought. And that will do it for now. We'll meet here next Sunday, and we'll talk about the rest of the Quenta Silmarillion before we move on. So I'll wrap this up for now, but I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.